In the land between two rivers, where the first cities rose and writing was born, the night was not a time for rest. It was a time to protect the soul. Tonight, we step into the shadows of ancient Mesopotamia, where sleep came with sacred rituals and a quiet fear of unseen spirits. From protective amulets to night gods carved in stone, you'll discover why bedtime was filled with more prayers than peace, and why no one truly slept alone. If softly spoken fears from ancient worlds help calm your thoughts, you're in the right place. Subscribe now and hit the bell icon to keep exploring the mystical, the forgotten, and the quietly powerful layers of history, one eerie, peaceful night at a time. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? It's always amazing to see how far our quiet little stories are reaching. You are lying on your reed mat in a simple mud brick house in ancient Babylon, circa 1750 BCE. The sun has long since disappeared beyond the Euphrates, and the only light in your single-room dwelling comes from a small sesame oil lamp flickering near the doorway. Its frame has been painted bright red, a protective measure your family has maintained for generations, though tonight you wonder if it will be enough. Your pregnant wife sleeps fitfully beside you, one hand protectively covering her swollen belly, while your 2-year-old daughter rests on a smaller mat nearby. The night air carries the usual sounds of the city settling into sleep. Distant conversations, the occasional bleat of a goat, dogs barking in the narrow streets. But there is something else tonight, a sound that makes your blood run cold and your hand instinctively reach for the small bronze amulet hanging around your neck. It begins as a low howl, almost like wind through the reed marshes, but there is something distinctly wrong about it. The sound seems to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the flat rooftops and seeping through the small windows high in your walls. This is not the cry of any earthly creature, and every parent in Mesopotamia knows what it means, is abroad tonight, hunting for the children she craves above all else. Your knowledge of this demoness has been passed down through generations of fearful whispers and hurried preparations. Lamashtu is described in the ancient texts as bearing the head of a lion, the teeth of a donkey, naked breasts, and a hairy body with hands permanently stained, many believe with the blood of her countless victims. Her fingers are unnaturally long, ending in sharp nails that can tear through flesh as easily as cloth, and her feet are those of Anzu, the great storm bird. But it is not her physical appearance that strikes the deepest terror into the hearts of Mesopotamian families. It is her insatiable hunger for the blood of human infants and her particular skill at finding them in the darkest hours of the night, which have survived from Babylon, Assyria, Sumer, and Hattusa, speak of her in terms that are both protective and terrifying. These are not gentle songs meant merely to soothe babies to sleep, but magical incantations designed to ward off very real supernatural threats. One such lullaby, translated from ancient Akkadian, warns, "Sleep, sleep, my little one, sleep tight, sleep well. The house is protected, the demons are held at bay. Lamashtu shall not enter here, her howl shall not wake you." The very fact that parents felt compelled to include such warnings in their bedtime rituals reveals the profound anxiety that surrounded every act of putting a child to sleep in ancient Mesopotamia. The texts tell us that Lamashtu bore 7 different names and was sometimes described collectively as 7 witches in incantations, suggesting that her threat was not singular but manifold. Her evil deeds, according to, included slaying children, unborns and neonates, causing harm to mothers and expectant mothers, eating men and drinking their blood, disturbing sleep, bringing nightmares, killing foliage, infesting rivers and lakes, and being a bringer of disease, sickness, and death. This comprehensive catalogue of malevolence meant that no family could ever feel entirely safe, but the nighttime hours brought the greatest danger. As you lie listening to that otherworldly howl growing closer, you remember the stories your grandmother told you about Lamashtu's hunting methods. She does not simply appear and attack, she is cunning, patient, methodical. The demoness is said to approach sleeping households in the deepest part of the night, when the oil lamps burn lowest and even the dogs have fallen into exhausted slumber. She moves like shadow itself, sliding through the smallest gaps in doorways, seeping through window openings, sometimes even emerging from the very walls like smoke given malevolent form. Her primary targets are pregnant women and newborn children, but her appetite extends to any child she can reach. The ancient accounts describe her method with horrifying precision. She touches the bellies of women in labor, reaching inside with those elongated, blood-stained fingers to pull out unborn babies. For those children who have already entered the world, her approach is equally terrifying. She positions herself beside sleeping children, her lion's head lowering close to their small faces, her donkey teeth bared in a predatory grin. Then comes what the texts describe as her death embrace, her hands described as being like a net, closing around the child in a grip that leaves no escape. But Lamashtu's nocturnal activities extend beyond physical violence. The incantations speak of her ability to disturb sleep and bring nightmares, suggesting that her presence alone could poison the rest of an entire household. Parents who managed to protect their children from her direct attacks often found themselves plagued by terrible dreams, visions of their offspring being torn from their arms by a howling, lioness-headed demon. These nightmares were not considered mere psychological responses to fear. In Mesopotamian belief, they were actual attacks, attempts by Lamashtu to weaken the spiritual defenses of the family and prepare them for a future, more successful assault. The sound outside your window grows closer now, and you can hear something that chills you to your core, the scratching of long nails against the mud brick walls of your home. Your wife stirs in her sleep, one hand moving protectively to her belly, as if some part of her unconscious mind recognizes the threat approaching. Your daughter whimpers but does not wake, and you find yourself frozen between the desperate desire to check on her and the equally strong instinct to remain perfectly still, hoping that Lamashtu will pass by your home in search of easier prey. The scratching stops. In the silence that follows, you can hear your own heartbeat and the rapid, shallow breathing of your wife. Has she moved on? Has the red paint around your doorframe proved sufficient protection? Or is this merely the pause before the true horror begins, the moment when Lamashtu prepares to test your family's defenses against the full weight of her supernatural malevolence? As you lie there in the flickering lamplight, surrounded by the protective amulets and charms your family has accumulated over years of fearful preparation, you cannot help but wonder, what drives a being to such focused, methodical evil? What cosmic purpose could be served by a creature whose entire existence seems devoted to the destruction of the most innocent members of human society? And perhaps most troubling of all, what does it say about the world itself that such elaborate precautions must be taken every single night, that no parent can ever put their child to sleep with complete confidence that they will wake again in the morning? The first line of defense against Lamashtu has already been established in your home, long before this terrifying night began. Those red-painted door frames that mark nearly every dwelling in Babylon are not mere decoration. They represent generations of accumulated wisdom about supernatural protection. The bright crimson pigment made from iron oxide mixed with animal blood and blessed by priests is believed to create a barrier that demons cannot easily cross. But you know, as every parent in Mesopotamia knows, that passive protection is rarely sufficient when dealing with a predator as determined and cunning as Lamashtu. The bronze amulet around your neck grows warm against your skin as you reach for the small clay figurine hidden beneath your sleeping mat. This object, no larger than your thumb, represents months of careful preparation and considerable expense for a family of modest means. The figurine bears the unmistakable features of Pazuzu: wings of a bird, feet of a raptor, a face that manages to be both leonine and human, surrounded by tiny cuneiform inscriptions in Akkadian that spell out protective formulas passed down through centuries of desperate parents. Pazuzu presents one of the great paradoxes of Mesopotamian protective magic. He is himself a demon, the king of the wind demons, son of Hanbi, who rules the demons of the underworld. Yet it is precisely his demonic nature that makes him effective against other supernatural threats. The principle operating here is not one of good defeating evil, but of evil being used to control and redirect other forms of evil. Pazuzu's protection comes not from benevolence but from territorial dominance. He drives away other demons not out of compassion for humans, but because they represent challenges to his own supernatural authority. The small figurine in your hand serves multiple protective functions. Its presence in your home draws Pazuzu's attention to your family, marking you as under his protection. But the magic is more complex than simple invocation. The amulet must be properly activated through ritual, and the timing of that activation is crucial. As you hold the figurine, you begin the whispered incantation your father taught you. Pazuzu, king of the evil wind demons, son of Hanbi, come to this place. Drive away she who kills children, she who steals unborn babies, she who brings nightmares to mothers. Let your terrible presence be a shield around this house. The scratching sound returns, more insistent now, accompanied by a low growling that seems to vibrate through the very walls of your home. Your wife wakes with a gasp, her hand immediately going to the small Pazuzu pendant that hangs at her throat. She looks at you with wide, frightened eyes, and you see her lips moving in silent prayer, not to the great gods of the pantheon, but to the demons and spirits who might offer more immediate protection against the supernatural predator outside your walls. This is the terrible arithmetic of survival in ancient Mesopotamia. The official religious hierarchy offers little comfort against the specific threats that haunt the dark hours. While the great temples of Marduk and Ishtar provide structure and meaning to public life, the intimate terror of protecting your family from supernatural attack requires more immediate, more pragmatic solutions. The priests who serve the major deities may offer blessings and general protection, but when Lamashtu howls outside your window, you turn to the darker powers that understand her nature because they share her realm. Your daughter begins to cry, a soft, frightened whimper that cuts through the night air like a beacon for any supernatural predator in the vicinity. Your wife immediately begins a lullaby, but not one of the gentle songs you might expect. Instead, she sings one of the protective chants specifically designed to confuse and deter Lamashtu. Sleep now, little star, sleep now, little moon. The demons have counted the children and found them all present. There is no room here for the howling one, no place for the child taker, Sleep now, the count is complete. This lullaby employs one of the most sophisticated protective strategies available to Mesopotamian parents, the concept of spiritual accounting. The idea is that demons like Lamashtu operate according to certain supernatural rules and limitations. If they can be convinced that their target has already been claimed, counted, or protected by competing supernatural forces, they may be compelled to seek easier prey elsewhere. The lullaby therefore presents your child as already accounted for in some cosmic census, leaving no opening for Lamashtu's predatory intervention. As your wife sings, you carefully place the Pazuzu figurine near your daughter's head, positioning it so that its fierce gaze faces toward the doorway. The small bronze demon seems to glare with intensified malevolence in the flickering lamplight, its raptor feet extended as if ready to tear into any supernatural intruder. The positioning is critical. The figurine must be able to see potential approaches to the sleeping child while remaining close enough to extend its protective influence over her vulnerable form. But even with these precautions in place, you know that protection against Lamashtu requires active, ongoing vigilance. The demons of Mesopotamia are not easily discouraged, and their patience far exceeds that of any human adversary. Stories passed down through generations tell of households that maintained their defenses successfully for weeks or months, only to suffer devastating attacks when their attention wandered or their protective rituals grew slack. The oil lamp near the doorway flickers, its flame dancing in a draught that seems to come from nowhere. In that brief moment of wavering light, you catch sight of something that makes your blood freeze, a shadow that moves independently of any object that could cast it, sliding along the wall with fluid, predatory grace. The shadow pauses near the window, and you can swear you see the outline of a leonine head turning slowly to survey the interior of your home. Your wife sees it too. Without breaking her protective lullaby, she reaches for the small bag of salt that hangs from a peg near her sleeping mat. Salt, blessed by the priests of Enki and mixed with dust from the threshold of a temple, is another weapon in the arsenal against supernatural attack. She begins to trace a small circle around your daughter with the salt, her movements careful and deliberate. The white granules create a visible barrier, but more importantly, they establish a spiritual boundary that demons are believed to find difficult to cross. As she completes the circle, the growling outside grows louder, more frustrated. The shadow on the wall seems to writhe with increasing agitation, stretching and contracting, as if testing the spiritual defenses you have erected. This is the crucial moment, the point at which Lamashtu will either retreat to seek easier prey or commit to a sustained assault on your family's protections. You find yourself wondering about the other families throughout Babylon who are facing this same terrible vigil tonight. In houses throughout the city, parents are clutching protective amulets, whispering defensive incantations, and positioning themselves between their sleeping children and the supernatural threats that prowl the dark hours. How many families will see the dawn with all their members intact? How many children will disappear before morning, leaving behind only grieving parents and the echo of demonic laughter? The thought that strikes you most forcefully is how normal this has become. The nightly preparation for supernatural attack, the careful positioning of protective objects, the whispered invocations to demons and spirits, all of this represents the routine reality of family life in ancient Mesopotamia. You are not facing an exceptional crisis, but rather participating in a ritual of protection that plays out in countless homes every single night. The sinister truth about bedtime in your world is not that it occasionally involves supernatural danger, but that such danger is so constant, so expected, that elaborate defenses against it have become as natural and necessary as preparing food or maintaining shelter. What kind of cosmos, you wonder, requires parents to negotiate with demons
In order to protect their children?
And what does this say about the fundamental nature of existence itself, when the act of sleeping, the most basic human need for rest and vulnerability, becomes a nightly confrontation with forces that exist solely to destroy the innocent? The salt circle holds. As the first pale suggestion of dawn begins to lighten the eastern sky, the shadow on your wall grows fainter, more diffuse, until it finally dissipates entirely. The growling fades to a distant echo, then stops altogether. Your wife's protective lullaby gradually shifts into genuine song, and your daughter's breathing deepens into peaceful sleep. But the relief you feel is tempered by a terrible knowledge. This victory is temporary, and the danger will return with the next sunset. Lamashtu's retreat at dawn is not an accident of timing, but a fundamental aspect of her supernatural nature. Like many demons in the Mesopotamian pantheon, her power is intimately connected to darkness and diminishes with the approach of light. The ancient texts describe her as a creature of the night hours, when the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of demons becomes thin and permeable. As the sun rises, that boundary strengthens, forcing supernatural predators like Lamashtu to retreat to the shadowy spaces where their power remains intact. But her temporary absence brings
no lasting peace.
The evidence of her nocturnal visit remains visible throughout your home. Scratches on the exterior walls, disturbed dust around the windows, and most unsettling of all, the distinct odor that clings to places where she has lingered. A smell, like copper and decay, that no amount of cleansing seems able to completely eliminate. Your wife notices it first, wrinkling her nose as she moves about the room in the early morning light. "She was close," she whispers, her voice still tight with residual fear. Closer than she has ever been before. This escalation troubles you more than the actual attack. Lamashtu's behavior suggests increasing boldness, a growing confidence in her ability to overcome your family's defenses. Perhaps your daughter's development, her transition from infant to toddler, has made her a more attractive target. Or perhaps the demoness has simply grown frustrated with the repeated failures to penetrate your protective measures and is preparing for a more sustained campaign. The morning brings visitors, as it always does after a night when Lamashtu has been abroad. Your neighbor, an elderly woman named Ninlil, who has survived more supernatural encounters than most, arrives just after sunrise with fresh bread and a grim expression. "Did you hear her?" she asks without preamble. "She took the baker's infant son, found him cold in his cradle this morning, with those marks on his throat." The news hits you like a physical blow. The baker's house is only 3 streets away, close enough that Lamashtu might have visited your home either before or after her successful attack on that unfortunate family. Ninlil's report contains details that will haunt your thoughts throughout the day. The baby showed signs of what the texts describe as Lamashtu's death embrace. Tiny finger marks around the throat, scratches on the arms and chest, and most tellingly, an expression of terror frozen on the infant's face. The mother says she
"Woke in the night but saw nothing," Ninlil continues. "Found salt scattered everywhere, as if there had been a great struggle. The father's amulets were all turned backward on their cords."
This last detail is particularly ominous. The systematic reversal of protective amulets suggests not just a successful attack, but a demonstration of supernatural power, Lamashtu sending a message to the entire neighborhood about her ability to overcome even carefully prepared defenses. Such displays are designed to weaken the psychological resolve of other families, making them more vulnerable to future attacks through increased fear and desperation. As the day progresses, more stories emerge from throughout your district. A pregnant woman 2 houses down reports terrible nightmares in which a lioness-headed demon pressed its claws into her belly, promising to return for her unborn child. A family near the canal found their protective salt circles broken and their Pazuzu figurines thrown into the water. An elderly man who sleeps alone speaks of hearing children's voices calling for help from inside his walls, though no children live in his household. These reports reveal the comprehensive nature of Lamashtu's campaign. She is not simply hunting for individual victims, but working systematically to undermine the spiritual defenses of the entire community. Each successful attack weakens the collective confidence in protective measures, while each failed attempt provides her with information about which defenses are most effective and therefore most urgently in need of being overcome. By midday, a delegation of worried parents has assembled at your door. Your family's successful defense against Lamashtu's direct approach has given you an unwanted reputation as experts in supernatural protection. People want to know exactly which amulets you used, how you positioned them, what specific incantations proved effective. But you find yourself reluctant to share detailed information, partly from a superstitious fear that discussing successful protections might somehow weaken them, and partly from the growing realization that no defensive strategy remains effective indefinitely. The problem with supernatural predators like Lamashtu is their learning capacity. Unlike wild animals or human criminals, demons accumulate knowledge across multiple encounters and adapt their tactics accordingly. Each failed attack teaches them something new about their intended victim's defensive capabilities. This means that families cannot rely on the same protective strategies indefinitely. Successful defenses must constantly evolve to stay ahead of demonic adaptation. Your wife spends the afternoon consulting with local specialists in protective magic. The woman who crafted your Pazuzu figurine suggests commissioning a more powerful amulet, one inscribed with additional protective formulas and blessed with more extensive rituals. A priest from the local temple of Enki recommends performing a purification ceremony for your entire household, including the burning of specific herbs and the recitation of lengthy invocations to multiple protective deities. An elderly man who claims descent from ancient exorcist families proposes the ultimate deterrent, a complete demon trap. This last suggestion involves the most elaborate and expensive protective ritual available to ordinary families. A demon trap requires the creation of a false target, a specially prepared figurine designed to attract supernatural predators and then destroy them through contained magical forces. The process takes weeks to complete and requires rare materials: clay mixed with grave dirt, bronze blessed by 7 different priests, and inscriptions in the ancient Sumerian script that only trained exorcists can properly execute. But even as you consider these escalating protective measures, you cannot escape a fundamental question about the nature of existence in ancient Mesopotamia. Why should ordinary families be forced to become experts in supernatural warfare simply to protect their sleeping children? What cosmic arrangement demands that parents must choose between increasingly expensive magical defenses and the constant terror of losing their offspring to demonic predators? The sun reaches its zenith, providing temporary safety, but you know that the hours of daylight are numbered. Soon the shadows will begin to lengthen, darkness will return to the narrow streets of Babylon, and families throughout the city will once again prepare for the nightly siege that defines domestic life in your world. Tonight, your defenses may hold again, but Lamashtu is patient, adaptive, and relentless. Sooner or later, every family's luck runs out. As afternoon gives way to evening, you begin the familiar preparations once more. Oil lamps are filled and positioned. Protective amulets are checked and repositioned. The salt circles are refreshed. Your wife begins the evening's first protective lullaby, while your daughter plays contentedly, unaware of the elaborate defenses being erected around her innocent sleep. And you find yourself wondering, as you have wondered every night for months, whether this will be the evening when all your precautions prove insufficient, when Lamashtu's persistence finally overcomes your vigilance, when the howling in the dark finally claims the victory it has so patiently sought. The terrible truth about bedtime in ancient Mesopotamia is not just the constant presence of supernatural danger, but the psychological burden of maintaining eternal vigilance against threats that never truly disappear. Sleep becomes not rest, but warfare. Night brings not peace, but siege. And every parent must become a soldier in an endless conflict against the malevolent forces that prowl the darkness, seeking the innocent souls that represent their most cherished prey. You stand in the workshop of Sin, the finest bronze worker in all of Babylon, watching him put the finishing touches on what may be your family's salvation or its damnation. The small figurine taking shape under his skilled hands bears the unmistakable features of Pazuzu, the body of a man crowned with the head of a lion or dog, 4 wings spreading from a powerful torso, hands that end in talons, and feet that are unmistakably those of a bird of prey. But it is the face that commands attention, a countenance that manages to convey both protective intent and barely restrained malevolence, as if the demon's willingness to help comes with a price that has not yet been fully revealed. Sin works by the light of multiple oil lamps, their flames casting dancing shadows that make the bronze figurine seem almost alive. His hands, stained permanently black from years of working with metals and the various substances required for proper blessing of protective objects, move with the confidence of someone who has created hundreds of such talismans, yet you notice a certain tension in his movements today, a carefulness that suggests even an expert craftsman approaches the creation of a Pazuzu amulet with considerable respect and perhaps a measure of fear. The bronze must be blessed before the shaping begins, he explains as he works, his voice low and measured. 7 priests from 7 different temples, each offering their own protective formulas. But the real power comes not from the blessings of men, but from the attention of Pazuzu himself. Once this figurine is completed and properly activated, it will draw his notice. He will know your family, know your home, know your children. Sin pauses in his work to look directly at you. Are you certain you understand what this means? The question hangs in the air like incense smoke, heavy with implications that extend far beyond simple supernatural protection. To invite Pazuzu's attention is to enter into a relationship with one of the most powerful demons in the Mesopotamian hierarchy. Pazuzu exists in a realm of power and malevolence that ordinary humans can barely comprehend. His protection comes not from benevolence but from territorial dominance. He defends your family not because he cares about human welfare, but because other demons represent challenges to his supernatural authority. This arrangement forces Mesopotamian families into a peculiar moral position. To protect their children from demons like Lamashtu, they must ally themselves with an even more powerful demon whose own nature is fundamentally destructive and chaotic. Pazuzu's mythological reputation includes bringing plague-bearing winds, causing droughts, and stirring up violent storms that destroy crops and flatten buildings. His protection of humans against other supernatural threats represents not an act of kindness but a kind of supernatural politics, the management of competing demonic interests in which human welfare is merely a secondary consideration. You think of your daughter sleeping peacefully at home, unaware that her parents are negotiating for her safety with forces that exist beyond the normal boundaries of human understanding. Last night's encounter with Lamashtu has convinced you that passive protections, salt circles, blessed doorframes, conventional amulets are no longer sufficient. The child-killing demoness showed increasing boldness, testing your defenses, with a persistence that suggests she has marked your family for special attention. Standard protective measures may delay her, but they cannot eliminate the threat she represents. Ibisin returns to his work using a small tool to inscribe cuneiform characters along the base of the figurine. These are not ordinary Akkadian words, but ancient Sumerian formulas, protective incantations whose meanings have been preserved through centuries of careful transmission from master craftsmen to their apprentices. The inscriptions serve multiple purposes. They identify the figurine as a legitimate vessel for Pazuzu's power, they provide specific instructions for his protective intervention, and they establish the terms of the supernatural contract being created between your family and the Demon King. The words must be perfect, Ibisin murmurs as he works. One incorrectly formed character, one misplaced stroke, and the figurine becomes worse than useless. It becomes dangerous. Pazuzu does not forgive carelessness, and a flawed invocation might bring his wrath instead of his protection. He shows you the tiny symbols taking shape under his tool, wedge-shaped marks that seem to pulse with their own inner life in the flickering lamplight. These particular formulas have been tested across generations. They tell Pazuzu that your family seeks his protection specifically against Lamashtu and her kind, that you offer him proper respect and acknowledgement of his authority, and that you understand the obligations such protection entails. The concept of obligation in supernatural protection represents one of the most complex aspects of Mesopotamian religious practice. Unlike prayers to benevolent deities who might grant aid out of compassion or divine duty, negotiations with protective demons involve explicit reciprocal relationships. Pazuzu's protection is not free. It requires ongoing acknowledgement, respect, and occasionally more substantial forms of payment. Families who accept his aid must be prepared to make regular offerings, to speak his name with proper reverence, and to avoid actions that might be interpreted as ingratitude or betrayal. As the afternoon progresses, other customers arrive in Ibisin's workshop, each seeking protective objects for their own families. A merchant's wife requests a set of small bronze dogs to place around her children's sleeping mats, protective figures that are less powerful than Pazuzu amulets, but also less dangerous to employ. An elderly priest commissions a complex amulet, combining symbols from multiple protective traditions, hedging his supernatural bets by invoking several different sources of defensive power simultaneously. A young father, his face drawn with exhaustion and worry, quietly asks about the possibility of obtaining what he calls stronger medicine, protective magic, powerful enough to ward off direct demonic assault rather than mere supernatural harassment. Each transaction reveals the gradations of supernatural threat that define daily life in ancient Mesopotamia. Ordinary families might rely on simple protective charms and household rituals to ward off minor spiritual harassment. More serious threats require more powerful countermeasures, specialized amulets, blessed objects, complex protective rituals performed by trained specialists. But the most dangerous supernatural predators, demons like Lamashtu who actively hunt human prey, demand the ultimate protective strategy. Alliance with equally powerful malevolent forces who can match their supernatural adversaries in strength and cunning. The Bronze Workers' Workshop serves as an informal information center for supernatural threats and defensive strategies. As he works, Ibisin shares news from throughout the city. Which neighborhoods have experienced recent demonic activity? which protective techniques have proven effective, which families have suffered supernatural attacks despite seemingly adequate defenses. This intelligence network reflects the reality that supernatural protection in ancient Mesopotamia is not a private matter, but a community concern. Threats that overwhelm one family's defenses may soon target their neighbors, while successful protective strategies must be shared to benefit the entire community. The baker's family has commissioned 3 Pazuzu figurines, Ibisin mentions quietly, as he applies final details to your amulet. 1 for each surviving child. They've also requested a complete household purification and the installation of permanent protective inscriptions around every doorway and window. The baker's tragic loss of his infant son to Lamashtu has apparently prompted the most comprehensive defensive measures available to ordinary citizens, but I wonder if even that will be sufficient. Lamashtu has tasted blood from that household now. She knows their smell, their vulnerabilities, their daily routines. Standard protections may not be enough. This observation touches on one of the most terrifying aspects of supernatural predation in Mesopotamian belief, the concept of demonic fixation. Once a malevolent spirit has successfully attacked a particular family, that household becomes a known target, a place of proven vulnerability that the demon will likely revisit. Each successful attack provides the supernatural predator with more detailed knowledge about their victim's defensive capabilities, daily routines, and psychological weak points. Families who survive initial demonic attacks often find themselves locked in escalating conflicts, forced to employ increasingly powerful and dangerous protective measures just to maintain the basic safety they previously took for granted. The sun begins its descent toward the western horizon, and you feel the familiar tension that accompanies the approach of darkness in your world. Soon the shadows will lengthen, the protective power of daylight will fade, and the supernatural predators that hunt the night hours will begin their ancient, patient stalking. Your completed Pazuzu figurine represents both hope and risk. Hope for more effective protection against the forces that threaten your family, and risk that you are inviting a power into your home whose true nature and ultimate intentions remain fundamentally alien to human understanding. As Ibisin places the
finished amulet in your hands,
you feel its weight, not just the physical mass of blessed bronze, but the spiritual gravity of the supernatural alliance you are about to forge. Tonight, for the first time, your family's safety will depend not on avoiding demonic attention, but on attracting it from the right source. You are about to discover whether protection purchased with supernatural currency proves more reliable than the traditional defenses that have served your ancestors for countless generations, and whether the price of such protection might ultimately prove higher than the threats it is meant to address. The ritual of activation must be performed at sunset, that liminal moment when day surrenders to night and the barriers between worlds grow thin. You stand in the small courtyard behind your home, the bronze Pazuzu figurine warm in your palms, while your wife maintains a careful watch over your sleeping daughter inside. The process of invoking a demon's protection requires precise timing, specific words, and most importantly, absolute certainty of purpose. Hesitation or fear during the invocation can turn what should be a protective summoning into something far more dangerous. Ibisin has provided detailed instructions for the activation ritual, written on a small clay tablet in his careful cuneiform script. The procedure combines elements from ancient Sumerian demon-calling traditions with more recent Babylonian innovations in supernatural protection. You begin by facing west toward the direction where the sun is setting and where, according to Mesopotamian cosmology, the gates between the mortal world and the realm of demons stand most widely open during the transitional hours. Pazuzu, king of the wind demons, son of Hambi, who rules the underworld legions, you begin your voice carefully modulated to convey respect without subservience, invitation without desperation. I call upon your power not as a supplicant, but as one who offers fair exchange. Hear my words and know my need. The formal opening establishes the terms of the relationship. You are not begging for divine mercy, but proposing a mutually beneficial arrangement between equals, albeit equals of vastly different power levels. The wind rises as you speak, though moments before the air had been still. This is no coincidence. Pazuzu's domain includes the winds that sweep across Mesopotamia, from the gentle breezes that cool the evening air to the devastating storms that can strip the flesh from a man's bones. The stirring of air currents signals his attention, his consideration of your proposal, his evaluation of whether your family represents a worthwhile investment of his protective power. You continue the invocation, following Ibisin's instructions precisely. As king of demons, you claim dominion over all supernatural threats to mortal families. I offer recognition of your authority, acknowledgement of your power, and proper respect for your territorial claims. In exchange, I ask that you extend your protection over this household, driving away the she-demon Lamashtu and all others who would harm those under your watch. The bronze figurine in your hands begins to grow noticeably warmer. This physical change signals the beginning of the supernatural bond being forged between your family and the demon king. Note that successful invocations produce tangible effects, changes in temperature, alterations in local wind patterns, sometimes even brief visual manifestations of the summoned entity's presence. These physical phenomena serve both as confirmation that the ritual is working and as reminders of the very real supernatural forces being invoked. But the warmth in your hands also carries a more subtle message. Pazuzu's power is now flowing into the bronze figurine, transforming it from a simple crafted object into a genuine supernatural artifact. This transformation creates a permanent link between your household and the demon king, a connection that will persist as long as the amulet remains in your possession and properly honored. Unlike temporary protective measures such as salt circles or blessed herbs, this alliance represents a fundamental change in your family's supernatural status. The wind intensifies, carrying with it scents that have no earthly origin. Copper and sulfur, ozone, and something that might be described as the smell of vast distances. These are the atmospheric signatures of Pazuzu's realm, the supernatural environment from which his power emanates. For a moment, the familiar courtyard of your home feels connected to spaces that exist far beyond the normal boundaries of human experience. You are no longer simply a Babylonian father protecting his family, but a participant in cosmic struggles between competing supernatural forces. As the invocation continues, you become aware of a presence observing your ritual, not the malevolent, stalking attention that characterized Lamashtu's approach, but something altogether more complex. Pazuzu's awareness feels ancient, calculating, fundamentally alien to human consciousness, yet capable of understanding human needs and desires. This is the attention of a being who has observed countless generations of mortal families, who has entered into protective agreements with thousands of households across the centuries, who knows both the benefits and the costs of such supernatural
alliances. Understand that protection carries obligations, you continue, reciting the words Ibisin insisted were crucial to any successful demon summoning. I accept that power shared must be power acknowledged. Let this household serve
as a place where your authority is respected, your name spoken with proper reverence, your territorial claims honored without question. These phrases constitute the binding elements of your supernatural contract, formal acknowledgement that Pazuzu's protection comes with ongoing responsibilities that your family must fulfill. The bronze figurine pulses with heat, and for an instant, you swear you can see something moving within the metal itself, a suggestion of wings, the gleam of predatory eyes, the outline of talons designed for tearing. This momentary animation signals the completion of the binding process. Pazuzu has accepted your offer and taken up residence, in some sense, within the protective amulet. From this moment forward, the figurine serves as both a beacon for his protective attention and a monitoring device that allows him to observe your family's adherence to the terms of your agreement. But even as you feel relief at the successful completion of the ritual, you cannot ignore a growing sense of unease about what you have just accomplished. The protection you have secured is real and powerful, but it comes from a source whose fundamental nature remains hostile to human welfare. Pazuzu defends your family not out of compassion, but as an expression of his own territorial dominance. Other demons will avoid your household not because they respect human life, but because they recognize the superior claim of a more powerful supernatural predator. This arrangement forces you to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of safety itself. Is protection that comes from evil sources morally equivalent to protection that comes from good? Does the source of safety matter as long as your children remain unharmed? And perhaps most troubling, what happens to a family that becomes dependent on demonic protection? Are you solving your supernatural problems or simply trading immediate threats for more complex and potentially more dangerous long-term obligations? The wind dies down as suddenly as it arose, leaving the courtyard in the profound stillness that often follows successful supernatural workings. The bronze figurine in your hands has returned to normal temperature, but you can feel that something fundamental has changed about the object. It no longer feels like a simple crafted item, but rather like a living thing in dormancy, a sleeping predator that will awaken whenever threats to your household require its attention. You carefully carry the activated amulet inside your home, where your wife waits with barely concealed anxiety. She has been listening to the invocation from behind the door, and her expression reveals both hope and apprehension about what you have accomplished. "Did he answer?" she asks quietly, her eyes fixed on the bronze figurine. "Can you feel his
presence?" The question is more complex than it might appear.
Pazuzu's response to your invocation is not simply a matter of yes or no, acceptance or rejection. Demon summoning creates layered supernatural relationships that unfold over time. The initial ritual establishes contact and basic terms, but the true nature of the protective arrangement reveals itself gradually through ongoing interactions between the demon and the protected family. You may not fully understand what you have agreed to until Pazuzu's protection is actually tested by supernatural threats. "Place it near the window," your wife suggests, "where it can watch the approaches to our home." But you hesitate, remembering Ibisin's warnings about the proper positioning of Pazuzu amulets. The figurine must be placed where it can observe potential threats, but it must also be positioned so that its malevolent gaze does not fall directly on the family members it is meant to protect. Pazuzu's defensive power operates through intimidation and supernatural dominance, qualities that can be as dangerous to allies as to enemies if not carefully managed. You finally settle on a small niche in the wall near your daughter's sleeping
area, a position that allows the figurine to survey the room while keeping its direct visual attention focused on the doorway and windows rather than on your sleeping child.
As you place the bronze demon in its new home, you whisper a brief acknowledgement. "Watch over this house, great Pazuzu. Let your terrible presence be our shield against all who would do us harm." The figurine seems to settle into its position with an almost organic satisfaction, as if finding its proper place in the household's protective arrangements. And for the first time in weeks, you feel something approaching genuine confidence about your family's safety during the coming night. But that confidence is tempered by the knowledge that you have fundamentally altered the spiritual dynamics of your household, introducing a supernatural presence whose long-term implications remain largely unknown. As darkness falls over Babylon, and the familiar sounds of evening settlement begin throughout the city, you prepare for your first night under Pazuzu's protection. Will his presence prove sufficient to deter Lamashtu's increasingly bold attacks? Will the Demon King's territorial dominance extend effectively to your particular household? And perhaps most importantly, what price will Pazuzu ultimately demand for the safety he provides, and will your family prove capable of paying it? The first test of Pazuzu's protection comes sooner than expected. You have barely settled into sleep when a sound outside your window jerks you back to wakefulness, not the familiar howling that announces Lamashtu's presence, but something altogether different. This is a deeper sound, a rumbling that seems to emanate from the very air itself, as if the wind has suddenly acquired a voice and learned to speak in tones of barely restrained violence. Your wife wakes beside you, her hand instinctively reaching for the small Pazuzu pendant at her throat, but her expression shows confusion rather than the stark terror that usually accompanies supernatural encounters. "That's not Lamashtu," she whispers, her voice carrying a mixture of relief and uncertainty. "But what is it?" The bronze figurine in its wall niche has begun to emit a faint glow, not visible light, but rather a kind of supernatural luminescence that seems to exist at the edge of perception. The small demon's features appear more pronounced in this strange radiance, its carved talons seeming to flex with predatory anticipation, its wings spread as if preparing for flight. This is Pazuzu responding to a detected threat, his protective attention focused and ready for supernatural combat. Outside, the rumbling intensifies, punctuated by what sounds almost like a conversation. Two inhuman voices engaged in some form of negotiation or confrontation. The exchange is conducted in no earthly language, consisting instead of sounds that bypass human hearing and seem to resonate directly in your bones. This is the discourse of demons, territorial negotiations being conducted in supernatural dialects that predate human civilization by eons. Through the small window, you catch glimpses of movement that defies normal visual interpretation. Shadows shift and writhe with independent life, while the very air seems to thicken and swirl in patterns that suggest massive forms moving just beyond the limits of human perception. This is not the stealthy approach that characterizes Lamashtu's hunting style, but rather an open confrontation between competing supernatural powers, a territorial dispute being settled according to rules that govern interactions between demonic entities. The conversation, if such a term can be applied to the exchange taking place, continues for what feels like hours, but is probably only minutes. Gradually, the intensity of the supernatural dialogue diminishes. The rumbling fades to a distant growl, then stops altogether. The shadows outside your window return to normal behavior, and the oppressive thickness in the air dissipates. The bronze figurine's glow fades back to normal, though its carved features seem somehow more satisfied, as if recording a successful territorial victory. Your daughter, remarkably, has slept through the entire encounter. Her peaceful breathing continues, undisturbed, and her sleeping position shows no signs of the restless movement that usually accompanies supernatural harassment. This tranquility represents one of the most immediate benefits of Pazuzu's protection, the establishment of a supernatural buffer zone around your household that prevents other demons from disturbing the sleep of protected family members. But the night's events also reveal the true nature of the protection you have purchased. Pazuzu has not eliminated the supernatural threats to your family. He has simply established himself as the dominant predator in your immediate territory. Other demons now avoid your household not because they have lost interest in harming your family, but because they recognize Pazuzu's superior claim and prefer to avoid confrontation with a more powerful supernatural entity. This realization brings both comfort and concern. On one hand, your family now enjoys more effective protection than conventional defensive measures could provide. Demons like Lamashtu, who might gradually overcome traditional protective barriers through persistent effort, are unlikely to challenge Pazuzu's territorial dominance directly. On the other hand, your safety now depends entirely on maintaining the favor of a being whose own nature is fundamentally malevolent and unpredictable. Over the following days, the effects of Pazuzu's presence become more apparent. Your daughter sleeps more peacefully than she has in months, no longer troubled by the nightmares and restless stirring that had become routine during Lamashtu's campaign of harassment. Your wife reports feeling more confident about moving through the house during evening hours, no longer constantly alert for signs of supernatural intrusion. The oppressive atmosphere that had characterized your home for weeks, the sense of being watched and hunted, has largely dissipated. But these benefits come with subtle costs that gradually become apparent. The bronze figurine requires daily acknowledgement, not elaborate rituals, but simple gestures of respect that reinforce the supernatural contract binding your family to Pazuzu's protection. Each morning, you must speak his name and express gratitude for his vigilance. Each evening, you must light a small oil lamp in the niche where his figurine rests, providing the supernatural illumination that demons prefer. These requirements are not burdensome in themselves, but they serve as constant reminders of your family's dependence on supernatural assistance. More significantly, you begin to notice changes in your own behavior and attitudes that seem to reflect Pazuzu's influence. You find yourself more quick to anger, more willing to resolve disputes through intimidation rather than negotiation. Your tolerance for perceived disrespect decreases noticeably, and you catch yourself taking satisfaction in the misfortunes of neighbors who have offended you. These personality shifts are subtle but persistent, as if prolonged exposure to demonic protection gradually aligns human temperament with supernatural values and priorities. Your wife experiences similar changes, though they manifest differently. Her protective instincts regarding your daughter intensify to near-obsessive levels, and she becomes increasingly suspicious of strangers who show interest in your child. She begins to speak more frequently about the importance of proper respect and grows intolerant of what she perceives as ingratitude from friends and neighbors who seek advice about supernatural protection. These attitudes are not entirely negative. They reflect legitimate concerns about family safety and social reciprocity, but their intensity and rigidity suggest influence from sources beyond normal human psychology. The neighborhood's response to your family's supernatural alliance proves complex and divided. Some families express envy and seek advice about obtaining similar protection for their own households. Others maintain careful distance, apparently concerned that prolonged association with demon-protected families might draw unwanted supernatural attention to their own homes. A few neighbors express outright disapproval, arguing that alliances with malevolent entities represent dangerous corruptions of proper religious practice. This social dimension of supernatural protection reflects broader tensions within Mesopotamia society about the appropriate relationships between humans and supernatural powers. While the official religious hierarchy emphasizes devotion to benevolent deities and proper observance of temple rituals, the practical realities of daily life often require more pragmatic approaches to supernatural threats. Families facing immediate demonic persecution cannot afford to wait for divine intervention that might never come. They need protection that works quickly and reliably, even if that protection comes from morally questionable sources. 6 months. After the initial summoning, you have grown accustomed to Pazuzu's presence in your household. The bronze figurine has become as familiar as any piece of furniture, and the daily rituals of acknowledgement have settled into comfortable routine. Your family's safety feels more secure than it has in years, and the immediate threats that once dominated your nightly concerns have receded to manageable background anxiety, but you cannot entirely escape the knowledge that your supernatural security comes with hidden costs and unknown long-term consequences. What happens if Pazuzu grows dissatisfied with your family's level of respect or gratitude? What price might he demand if more powerful demons challenge his territorial claims? And perhaps most troubling, how has prolonged exposure to demonic protection changed your family in ways that might not become apparent for years or even generations? The terrible irony of supernatural protection in ancient Mesopotamia is that safety purchased through demonic alliance often proves more reliable than safety sought through conventional religious means, but at the cost of fundamental changes in human nature and social relationships. You have succeeded in protecting your daughter from immediate supernatural threats, but the long-term implications of that protection remain as mysterious and potentially dangerous as the forces you originally sought to avoid. In seeking to preserve your family's humanity through supernatural protection, you may have inadvertently begun the process of surrendering it to influences that operate according to entirely non-human values and priorities. You wake in the deepest part of the night to a sound that should not exist, the whisper of your grandfather's voice calling your name from the direction of the Eastern Wall. Though your grandfather has been dead and properly buried for 3 years, the voice is unmistakably his, the same slight rasp from a throat scarred by years of breathing the chalky dust of limestone quarries, the same particular way of pronouncing the syllables of your childhood name. But there is something wrong with the tone, something hungry and desperate that was never present in his voice during life. "Come closer, child," the voice murmurs through the mud brick wall. "Come and hear what the dead have learned in the darkness beneath the earth." Your skin crawls with the recognition that this is not memory or dream, but something far more dangerous, a supernatural encounter with what the Mesopotamian texts call Giddim, the restless spirits of the dead who have found ways to slip back from the underworld and walk among the living. The Giddim represents the intelligence, personality, and divine spark that separates from the body at death and normally journeys to Irkalla, the realm of the dead ruled by the goddess Ereshkigal. These spirits are fully self-aware, retaining all the memories, emotions, and personal characteristics they possessed in life. Under normal circumstances, they remain in the underworld, sustained by the offerings and prayers of their living descendants. But when those obligations are neglected, or when the spirits die under traumatic circumstances, they can slip back into the world of the living as hungry, desperate entities seeking the sustenance and acknowledgement they have been denied. Your wife stirs beside you, her breathing quick and shallow with the kind of fear that comes from recognizing a threat that exists beyond normal human experience. She has heard the voice too, and her hand moves instinctively to cover your sleeping daughter's ear. A protective gesture based on the terrifying knowledge that Giddim enter their victims through the auditory canal, sliding into human consciousness. Like smoke seeping through cracks in a wall, the whispers multiply. What began as a single voice speaking from the Eastern Wall now becomes a chorus of the dead, each spirit calling out with its own particular need, or grievance. You recognize some of the voices. A cousin who drowned in the Euphrates 5 years ago, an elderly neighbor woman who died of fever last winter, even the voice of a child you remember dying in infancy decades ago. But there are other voices too, older, more distant, speaking in dialects of Akkadian, that have not been heard in living memory, representing dead from previous generations, whose names have been forgotten and whose graves have been lost to time. We
Hunger. The voices murmur in overlapping whispers that seem to come from every direction at once. We thirst for remembrance, for the offerings that give us substance in the realm of shadows.
We have been forgotten, abandoned, left to starve in the dust of Irkalla, while our descendants feast in the light. This is the fundamental grievance of the restless dead, the failure of the living to maintain the ritualized relationships that sustain spirits in their journey through the afterlife. Mesopotamian funerary practice is built around the understanding that death does not end familial obligations, but rather transforms them into new forms of reciprocal responsibility. That our dead require regular offerings of food and drink, water libations poured onto their graves, and formal recitation of their names in family prayers. These practices serve both practical and spiritual purposes. They provide the spiritual sustenance that Gidim need to maintain their existence in the underworld, and they strengthen the bonds between the living and the dead that form the foundation of family identity across generations. When these obligations are neglected, whether through deliberate abandonment, gradual forgetfulness, or the practical difficulties of maintaining complex ritual schedules, the affected spirits begin to experience something analogous to starvation. Cut off from the spiritual nourishment provided by the living, they grow increasingly desperate and begin seeking alternative sources of sustenance. The most accessible of these alternatives is direct contact with living humans, achieved through a form of supernatural parasitism in which the Gidim enters a person's body and feeds on their life force directly. The process of entry through the ear represents one of the most terrifying aspects of Mesopotamian ghost beliefs. Unlike demons, who typically attack their victims through physical violence or external psychological harassment, Gidim employ a more intimate and invasive approach. They slide into human consciousness through the auditory canal, establishing themselves within their host's mind, where they can influence thoughts, emotions, and behavior while slowly draining the spiritual energy they need for continued existence. This form of supernatural invasion is particularly difficult to detect in its early stages. The initial symptoms, subtle changes in personality, unexplained mood shifts, persistent fatigue, can easily be attributed to natural causes. By the time the possession becomes obvious, the Gidim has typically established such a strong presence within the host that removal requires complex and potentially dangerous exorcism procedures. Listen to us, your grandfather's voice continues, now joined by what sounds like dozens of other spirits speaking in unison. We know secrets that the living have forgotten. We have walked in the darkness beneath the earth and learned the hidden ways that connect all things. Let us enter, and we will share our knowledge. Let us taste life again through your breath, and we will tell you of wonders beyond imagination. These offers of forbidden knowledge represent another dangerous aspect of Gidim encounters. The dead genuinely do possess information unavailable to the living, knowledge of future events gleaned from their position outside normal temporal limitations, secrets about supernatural threats and protective measures learned through direct contact with otherworldly forces, and intimate details about the afterlife experience that could provide valuable guidance for the living. But accepting such knowledge always comes at the cost of allowing the spirit's temporary or permanent residence within human consciousness, with consequences that can extend far beyond the immediate exchange of information. Your daughter begins to stir, her small face turning toward the eastern wall as if drawn by sounds that exist just below the threshold of normal hearing. This response particularly alarms you because children are considered especially vulnerable to Gidim influence. Their minds are less firmly established, their psychological boundaries more permeable, their natural skepticism less developed. Spirits seeking entry into the world of the living often target children first, using them as gateways to entire families. You rise carefully from your sleeping mat and move toward the wall where the voices seem strongest. The mud brick construction feels unnaturally cold to the touch, as if the presence of multiple spirits has somehow drained the warmth from the very materials of your home. When you press your ear against the wall, the whispers become more distinct, more individually recognizable. Each spirit seems to be telling a different story. Accounts of their deaths, descriptions of their experiences in the underworld, pleas for remembrance, and proper funerary offerings. But beneath these individual narratives runs a common thread of accusation and demand. The dead are calling the living to account for failures of memory and ritual obligation. They are demanding payment of spiritual debts that have accumulated across years or even decades of neglect. Most unsettling of all, they are warning of consequences that extend far beyond the current supernatural encounter. The barriers grow thin, your grandfather's voice whispers, with increasing urgency. The gates of Irkala cannot hold much longer against the press of the forgotten dead. Soon we will come in numbers too great to count, seeking the sustenance we have been denied. The living will learn what it means to abandon those who gave them life. This prophecy touches on one of the most fundamental fears in Mesopotamian culture, the possibility of a mass return of the unquiet dead. Individual Gidim encounters, while dangerous, can be managed through proper protective measures and ritual responses. But the prospect of widespread spiritual uprising, thousands of forgotten dead returning simultaneously to claim what they believe they are owed, represents a threat to the very foundations of civilized society. As you stand listening to the voices of the dead pressing against the walls of your home, you cannot escape the knowledge that your family is facing more than a simple supernatural encounter. You are confronting the accumulated consequences of generational failures to maintain proper relationships with the deceased, and the solutions available to you may prove insufficient to address the scope of the problem. The whispers through the veil are not just requests for attention, they are demands for justice from the forgotten dead, and the price of that justice may be higher than the living can afford to pay. Dawn brings no relief from the voices. As pale sunlight filters through the small windows of your home, you realize with growing dread that the supernatural encounter you experienced during the night was not an isolated incident, but rather the beginning of a sustained spiritual siege. The whispers continue throughout the morning hours, though they become fainter and more difficult to distinguish during daylight. This persistence violates one of the fundamental assumptions about Gidim behavior, that spirits of the dead, like most supernatural entities, are primarily nocturnal and retreat to shadowy places when the sun rises. The continued presence of the voices forces you to confront an uncomfortable truth about your family's spiritual obligations. Sitting in your courtyard with a clay tablet and stylus, you begin the grim task of calculating exactly how many dead you should be honoring with regular offerings and prayers. The list grows longer and more troubling as you work. Parents and grandparents, aunts and uncles, cousins who died in childhood, family friends who were close enough to merit inclusion in household rituals, even servants and workers whose long service to your family created bonds of mutual obligation that extend beyond death. The mathematics of memory prove overwhelming. By conservative estimate, your family should be maintaining active spiritual relationships with nearly 40 deceased individuals, each requiring specific forms of acknowledgement on a regular basis. Water libations should be poured on their graves monthly. Food offerings should be left at household shrines weekly. Their names should be spoken in family prayers daily. Special festivals should be observed annually to honor their continued presence in family life. The sheer logistics of maintaining these obligations would require several hours of spiritual labor every day, along with significant ongoing expenses for food, drink, and ceremonial materials. Your wife joins you in the courtyard, her own expression reflecting the gravity of what you are calculating together. "We have been negligent," she admits quietly, her voice heavy with a guilt that extends far beyond personal failing. Not intentionally, but there are so many, and life among the living demands so much attention. The children need food and shelter and protection from immediate threats. The fields require constant work. The household gods demand their own offerings. Where were we supposed to find time for 40 separate funeral cults? This predicament reflects one of the central tensions in Mesopotamian religious life, the conflict between the theoretical requirements of proper spiritual practice and the practical limitations of ordinary human existence. Religious texts and priestly instructions assume that families will maintain elaborate networks of relationship with deceased ancestors, but the actual demands of daily survival often may be. But beneath these individual narratives runs a common thread of accusation and demand. The dead are calling the living to account for failures of memory and ritual obligation. They are demanding payment of spiritual debts that have accumulated across years or even decades of neglect. Most unsettling of all, they are warning of consequences that extend far beyond the current supernatural encounter. "The barriers grow thin," your grandfather's voice whispers, with increasing urgency. "The gates of Irkala cannot hold much longer against the press of the forgotten dead. Soon we will come in numbers too great to count, seeking the sustenance we have been denied. The living will learn what it means to abandon those who gave them life." This prophecy touches on one of the most fundamental fears in Mesopotamian culture, the possibility of a mass return of the unquiet dead. Individual Giddim encounters, while dangerous, can be managed through proper protective measures and ritual responses. But the prospect of widespread spiritual uprising, thousands of forgotten dead returning simultaneously to claim what they believe they are owed, represents a threat to the very foundations of civilized society. As you stand listening to the voices of the dead pressing against the walls of your home, you cannot escape the knowledge that your family is facing more than a simple supernatural encounter. You are confronting the accumulated consequences of generational failures to maintain proper relationships with the deceased, and the solutions available to you may prove insufficient to address the scope of the problem. The whispers through the veil are not just requests for attention, they are demands for justice from the forgotten dead, and the price of that justice may be higher than the living can afford to pay. Dawn brings no relief from the voices. As pale sunlight filters through the small windows of your home, you realize with growing dread that the supernatural encounter you experienced during the night was not an isolated incident, but rather the beginning of a sustained spiritual siege. The whispers continue throughout the morning hours, though they become fainter and more difficult to distinguish during daylight. This persistence violates one of the fundamental assumptions about Giddim behavior, that spirits of the dead, like most supernatural entities, are primarily nocturnal and retreat to shadowy places when the sun rises. The continued presence of the voices forces you to confront an uncomfortable truth about your family's spiritual obligations. Sitting in your courtyard with a clay tablet and stylus, you begin the grim task of calculating exactly how many dead you should be honoring with regular offerings and prayers. The list grows longer and more troubling as you work. Parents and grandparents, aunts and uncles, cousins who died in childhood, family friends who were close enough to merit inclusion in household rituals, even servants and workers whose long service to your family created bonds of mutual obligation that extend beyond death. The mathematics of memory prove overwhelming. By conservative estimate, your family should be maintaining active spiritual relationships with nearly 40 deceased individuals, each requiring specific forms of acknowledgement on a regular basis. Water libations should be poured on their graves monthly. Food offerings should be left at household shrines weekly. Their names should be spoken in family prayers daily. Special festivals should be observed annually to honor their continued presence in family life. The sheer logistics of maintaining these obligations would require several hours of spiritual labor every day, along with significant ongoing expenses for food, drink, and ceremonial materials. Your wife joins you in the courtyard, her own expression reflecting the gravity of what you are calculating together. "We have been negligent," she admits quietly, her voice heavy with a guilt that extends far beyond personal failing. Not intentionally, but there are so many, and life among the living demands so much attention. The children need food and shelter and protection from immediate threats. The fields require constant work. The household gods demand their own offerings. Where were we supposed to find time for 40 separate funeral cults? Keep such comprehensive observance impossible. The result is a kind of spiritual debt that accumulates over time, creating exactly the conditions that drive neglected Giddim to seek alternative forms of sustenance. As you work on your calculations, neighbors begin arriving with reports of similar supernatural encounters throughout your district. An elderly merchant describes voices calling to him from the walls of his warehouse, speaking in the dialect of his hometown 200 miles to the south, the voices of family members he has not visited or honored in decades. A young mother reports that her infant son seems to be responding to sounds that she cannot hear, reaching toward empty corners of their home and babbling in what sounds almost like conversation with invisible presences. Most disturbing is the account provided by Shamash Nasir, a priest from the local temple of Marduk who has some training in spiritual matters. He describes a systematic pattern of Giddim activity that extends far beyond individual family grievances. The dead are organizing, he explains with barely concealed anxiety. They are sharing information about which families have failed in their obligations, which households are most vulnerable to spiritual invasion, which children might serve as the most accessible entry points into the world of the living. This is not random supernatural harassment. It is a coordinated campaign by the neglected dead to force acknowledgement of their needs. This intelligence transforms your understanding of the situation from a family crisis into a community-wide spiritual emergency. The voices calling to your family through the walls are part of a much larger supernatural movement, a collective action by the forgotten dead to demand redress for decades or centuries of accumulated neglect. Individual families cannot address this threat through isolated defensive measures. The scope of the problem requires coordinated response from entire neighborhoods, possibly the entire city. Shamash Nasir proposes an emergency solution, a massy ritual of acknowledgement designed to address the grievances of multiple family lines simultaneously. "We need a comprehensive offering," he explains. "Food and drink for the hungry dead, water libations for the thirsty, formal recitation of names stretching back multiple generations. Not individual household observances, but a community-wide ritual that demonstrates our collective commitment to honoring the spiritual obligations we have allowed to lapse." The logistical requirements for such a ritual prove staggering. Every family in the affected district would need to contribute food, drink, and ceremonial materials proportional to the number of dead they have failed to honor properly. A team of trained priests would need to coordinate the complex procedures required to address spiritual grievances from multiple family lines without creating conflicts between competing ancestral claims. Most challenging of all, the entire community would need to participate simultaneously, creating a unified spiritual front that demonstrates genuine commitment to reformed relationships with the deceased. But even as plans for the mass ritual take shape, you cannot ignore a more fundamental question about the nature of the supernatural crisis you are facing. Why are the Giddim returning now in such numbers and with such coordination? What has changed in the spiritual landscape of Mesopotamia to make this massive uprising of the neglected dead possible? And perhaps most troubling, are you and your neighbors dealing with natural consequences of accumulated spiritual negligence? Or are you facing something more deliberate, a supernatural assault organized by forces that exist beyond the normal realm of family ghosts and ancestral spirits? Your grandfather's voice provides a partial answer when it returns that evening, clearer and more urgent than before. The gates weaken, child. The barriers between worlds grow thin. Forces that have slept for ages are stirring in the deep places, and their awakening disturbs the normal order of death and life. We come not just for the offerings you have failed to provide, but as warnings of greater disturbances yet to come. This prophecy suggests that the Giddim encounters are symptoms of a much larger supernatural crisis, a general breakdown in the cosmic order that maintains separation between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. If your grandfather's warning proves accurate, then the community ritual being planned may address immediate symptoms without touching the underlying causes of the spiritual emergency. More comprehensive solutions may be required, involving not just local priests and neighborhood families, but the highest levels of Mesopotamian religious hierarchy and possibly intervention by the major deities themselves. As night falls and the voices of the dead grow stronger and more numerous, you face a choice between several inadequate options. You can continue trying to address individual family obligations while hoping that broader solutions emerge from community action. You can focus on protecting your immediate household through whatever defensive measures prove effective, essentially abandoning broader spiritual responsibilities in favor of short-term family survival. Or you can accept that the current crisis exceeds your capacity to solve and concentrate on learning as much as possible about the supernatural forces involved, hoping that such knowledge might prove useful when more comprehensive responses become available. Each option carries significant risks and uncertain benefits. But as you listen to the growing chorus of the dead pressing against the walls of your home, demanding acknowledgement, offering forbidden knowledge and warning of greater dangers yet to come, you realize that the luxury of perfect solutions has already disappeared. The mathematics of memory have revealed spiritual debts too large to repay, obligations too numerous to fulfill, and consequences too complex to predict or control. In the face of such overwhelming spiritual crisis, survival itself may require accepting relationships with forces that operate far beyond the comfortable boundaries of traditional family religion. 3 weeks into the siege of voices, your family has reached the limits of conventional resistance. The whispers no longer confine themselves to nighttime hours, but continue throughout the day, growing stronger during the transition periods of dawn and dusk when the boundary between worlds becomes most permeable. Your daughter has begun responding to sounds that you cannot hear, turning her head to follow invisible presences and occasionally babbling in what sounds disturbingly like conversation with entities only she can perceive. The community ritual, organized by Shamash Nasir, provided temporary relief. For exactly one night, the voices stopped entirely, suggesting that massive offerings and formal acknowledgements can indeed satisfy the immediate demands of the neglected dead. But by the second evening, the whispers had returned with renewed intensity, and now they carry a different tone. Where once the Giddim spoke with the desperate hunger of the forgotten, they now communicate with the confident authority of beings who have successfully established their presence in the world of the living. You begin to understand. Your grandfather's voice observes with satisfaction as you sit in your courtyard during the hour before sunset. The barriers between life and death are not absolute. They can be crossed, negotiated, rearranged to serve new purposes. We offer knowledge that the living cannot obtain any other way. We provide warnings about supernatural threats that your normal senses cannot detect. In exchange, we ask only for acknowledgement, for the small offerings that allow us to maintain our presence among those we love. This proposition represents a fundamental shift in the nature of your supernatural encounter. What began as harassment by hungry ghosts has evolved into something approaching a formal relationship, a covenant between the living and the dead that acknowledges the mutual benefits available through controlled spiritual communication. But accepting such a covenant means abandoning the traditional Mesopotamian model of death as final separation and embracing a more complex understanding of existence, in which the boundaries between life and death become permeable and negotiable. Your wife has reached her own conclusions about the situation. Perhaps this is not a crisis to be solved, but a transition to be managed, she suggests as you watch your daughter playing contentedly while apparently listening to invisible companions. Our ancestors are not our enemies. They are family members who continue to exist in different circumstances with different needs and different capabilities. If they can provide protection and knowledge unavailable through normal means, and if we can provide the acknowledgement and offerings they require, then perhaps we are being offered an opportunity rather than facing a threat. This perspective requires reconsidering everything you thought you understood about proper relationships between the living and the dead. Traditional Mesopotamian religion emphasizes clear separation. The dead belong in Irkala, the living belong in the world. Above, and contact between the two realms should be limited to formal ritual occasions. But the current situation suggests that such rigid separation may be neither necessary nor beneficial, that ongoing interactive relationships between living families and deceased ancestors might provide advantages unavailable through conventional spiritual practice. The evidence supporting this interpretation continues to accumulate. Over the past week, the voices of the dead have provided your family with increasingly valuable information. Your grandfather's spirit warned you about a structural weakness in your home's eastern wall 2 days before a crack actually appeared, allowing you to make repairs that prevented serious damage. Your deceased cousin provided detailed directions to a water source during a temporary disruption of the neighborhood's normal supply. Most significantly, multiple ancestral voices collaborated to warn you about a merchant who was planning to cheat you in a grain transaction, information that proved accurate and saved your family considerable expense. But these benefits come with costs that extend beyond the simple offerings of food and drink that the Giddim seem to require. Prolonged interaction with the dead appears to be changing your family in subtle but persistent ways. Your wife has become more withdrawn from normal social activities, preferring to spend time in conversation with spiritual presences that others cannot perceive. Your daughter's development shows increasingly unusual patterns. She demonstrates knowledge and insights that seem far beyond her years, but she also shows less interest in normal childhood activities and peer relationships. Most disturbing is the change you observe in yourself. The ongoing spiritual communication has made you increasingly sensitive to supernatural phenomena throughout your neighborhood. You can detect the presence of Giddim in other homes, sense the spiritual tensions created by neglected funerary obligations, and even perceive the emotional states of deceased family members in ways that have no precedent in your previous experience. This enhanced spiritual awareness provides valuable information but it also creates a sense of isolation from neighbors who do not share your supernatural sensitivity. The social implications of your family's spiritual evolution prove complex.
And troubling?
Other families in your district are dealing with their own Giddim encounters, but their responses vary widely. Some households have attempted to drive away the voices through traditional exorcism procedures. Others have tried to satisfy ancestral demands through increased offerings and formal ritual observances. A few families have simply abandoned their homes entirely, hoping that physical relocation might break whatever spiritual connections have been established. Your own approach, accepting ongoing dialogue with the dead and exploring the possibilities for mutually beneficial spiritual relationships, places you in a small minority of neighborhood families. Most of your neighbors view such experimentation as dangerous departure from proper religious practice. Some express concern that your spiritual innovations might attract unwanted supernatural attention to the entire district. A few families have begun to avoid social contact with your household entirely, apparently fearing that close association with people who maintain active relationships with the dead might somehow contaminate their own spiritual status. These social consequences force you to consider whether the benefits of enhanced spiritual communication justify the costs of increasing isolation from normal community life. Are you and your family evolving toward a more sophisticated understanding of existence that transcends traditional boundaries between life and death? Or are you being gradually drawn away from human community toward a supernatural realm whose values and priorities remain fundamentally alien to normal human welfare? Your grandfather's voice provides perspective on these questions during one of your evening conversations. Every generation must choose between the comfort of familiar limitations and the challenges of expanded possibility. We offer you knowledge and protection unavailable through conventional means, but accepting our gifts requires courage to venture beyond the boundaries that others accept without question. The living fear us because they do not understand that death is transformation, not termination. We remain who we were, but with access to realms of experience that the embodied cannot imagine. As autumn deepens and the nights grow longer, your family's supernatural relationships become more complex and sophisticated. What began as simple communication with individual ancestral spirits has evolved into participation in a broader network of the dead that extends far beyond your immediate family line. Through your grandfather's connections in the realm of shadows, you gain access to information and assistance from deceased individuals who have no direct relationship to your household, but who are willing to provide aid in exchange for the offerings and acknowledgments that sustain their continued existence. This expanded spiritual network proves remarkably effective at addressing practical problems. When your daughter develops a persistent fever that conventional medicine cannot treat, a long-dead physician provides detailed instructions for herbal remedies unknown to living healers. When questions arise about the legitimacy of a proposed business partnership, deceased merchants who dealt with the individuals involved provide character assessments based on their posthumous observations. When supernatural threats target your household, ancestral spirits coordinate with other friendly Giddim to create protective barriers that prove more reliable than conventional amulets or ritual defenses. But the most significant benefit of your expanded spiritual relationships emerges when Lamashtu returns to test your family's defenses. The child-killing demoness approaches your home on a moonless night in late autumn, her familiar howl echoing through the narrow streets of your district. But instead of the terror and desperate defensive preparations that previously characterized such encounters, you find yourself responding with confidence based on supernatural intelligence provided by your ancestral allies. "She hunts alone tonight," your grandfather's voice reports, as the demonic howling draws closer. Her usual supernatural escorts have been dispersed by territorial disputes with other predators. The protective spirits maintaining watch over this district have agreed to coordinate their defenses. Your family is not isolated prey, but part of a community that includes both living and dead. The confrontation with Lamashtu unfolds unlike any previous supernatural encounter you have experienced. Instead of trying to penetrate your household defenses directly, the demoness finds herself facing organized resistance from multiple sources simultaneously. Ancestral spirits materialize around your home, creating a barrier of protective presence that even a powerful demon cannot easily overcome. The voices of the dead shift from whispered communication to audible incantation, reciting protective formulas in languages that predate human civilization. Most remarkably, your daughter participates in the defense by serving as a conduit for spiritual energies, allowing deceased family members to focus their protective power more effectively than would be possible through purely spectral intervention. Lamashtu's retreat is swift and decisive. Faced with coordinated opposition from an alliance of living and dead, she abandons her assault on your household and seeks easier prey elsewhere in the city. But the successful defense leaves you with a profound realization about the nature of the spiritual evolution your family has undergone. You are no longer simply human beings seeking protection from supernatural threats. You have become participants in a mixed community of living and dead, sharing resources and responsibilities across the boundary of death itself. This transformation brings both extraordinary capabilities and serious obligations. Your family now has access to knowledge, protection, and assistance unavailable through any conventional means. But you also bear responsibility for maintaining relationships with dozens of deceased individuals, each with their own needs, preferences, and expectations. The spiritual labor required to sustain these relationships is considerable, involving daily offerings, regular communication, and ongoing attention to the complex social dynamics that govern interactions between multiple ancestral spirits. More challenging is the recognition that your spiritual evolution has fundamentally altered your family's relationship with the broader human community. Your neighbors increasingly view your household with a mixture of envy, suspicion, and outright fear. Some families seek your assistance with their own supernatural problems, hoping to benefit from your enhanced spiritual connections. Others maintain careful distance, concerned that close association with people who live in daily communion with the dead might attract unwanted ghostly attention to their own homes. A few neighbors have begun openly questioning whether your spiritual practices represent dangerous departures from proper religious observance that might ultimately bring divine punishment upon the entire district. These social tensions force you to consider the long-term implications of the path your family has chosen. Are you pioneering a new form of spiritual practice that others will eventually adopt? Or are you isolating yourselves from human community in ways that may prove irreversible? Will your enhanced supernatural capabilities provide sufficient compensation for the loss of normal social relationships? And what will happen to your daughter as she grows up in a household where daily conversation with the dead has become routine? Will she develop into a more spiritually sophisticated human being? Or will her prolonged exposure to post-human influences fundamentally alter her own nature in unpredictable ways? As winter approaches and the boundaries between worlds continue to blur, you realize that your family has crossed a threshold from which there may be no return. The covenant with the unquiet dead has provided remarkable benefits, but it has also committed you to a form of existence that operates according to rules and values that extend far beyond conventional human experience. You have solved the immediate problem of supernatural threats to your household, but only by accepting transformation into something that is no longer entirely human, a hybrid existence that spans the boundary between life and death, participating in both worlds while belonging fully to neither. The The terrible irony of spiritual evolution in ancient Mesopotamia is that the most effective solutions to supernatural problems often require abandoning the purely human perspective that created the need for those solutions in the first place. In seeking to protect your family from the dangers that lurk in the darkness between worlds, you have accepted membership in that same darkness, becoming part of the supernatural landscape that both fascinates and terrifies your entirely human neighbors. The price of comprehensive spiritual protection may be nothing less than the gradual surrender of human identity itself, traded for capabilities and relationships that transcend the normal limitations of mortal existence. You have never felt as vulnerable as you do now, standing in the courtyard of the aging exorcist Nergal-ushezib, as the sun disappears behind the western walls of Babylon, and the shadows begin their nightly conquest of the world. Tonight is different. From all of the previous nights of supernatural vigilance you have endured, tonight you will not simply defend your household against individual demons or negotiate with restless spirits. Tonight you will participate in the most comprehensive and demanding protective ritual available to ordinary citizens, the Maklu ceremony, literally meaning burning, designed to reverse active witchcraft and destroy the supernatural forces that have been systematically targeting your family for weeks. The decision to seek Nergal-ushezib's assistance came after 3 months of escalating supernatural harassment that proved resistant to conventional protective measures. What began as occasional nighttime disturbances, strange sounds, unexplained cold spots, objects moving without cause, has gradually intensified into sustained assault by what can only be described as organized supernatural malevolence. Your wife has been plagued by nightmares so vivid and consistent that she has stopped sleeping entirely during the darkest hours. Your daughter has developed an inexplicable wasting condition that no physician can diagnose or treat. Most disturbing of all, you have begun experiencing periods of complete memory loss, waking to discover that hours have passed without any recollection of your activities or whereabouts. These symptoms suggest not random demonic harassment, but deliberate supernatural assault, witchcraft performed by human practitioners who have allied themselves with malevolent spiritual forces for the specific purpose of destroying your family. The Maklu ritual represents the most extensive Babylonian response to such attacks, involving nearly 100 individual incantations performed throughout a single night, designed to identify the supernatural attackers, reverse their malevolent magic, and ultimately destroy them through spiritual combat. Nergal-ushezib himself embodies the accumulated wisdom of generations of exorcists and supernatural specialists. His weathered face bears the ritual scars that mark him as someone who has survived direct confrontations with the most dangerous entities in the Mesopotamian spirit world. His eyes hold the peculiar intensity that comes from years of seeing beyond the normal boundaries of human perception into realms where thought becomes substance and will becomes weapon. When he speaks, his voice carries the authority of someone who has successfully completed dozens of Maklu ceremonies and understands both their tremendous power and their considerable risks. The ritual begins after sunset with an invocation of the stars, the astral manifestations of the gods, he explains, as his assistants arrange the materials needed for the night's work. You will ally yourself with the gods of the netherworld,
asking them to imprison your supernatural attackers, and with the gods of heaven, requesting purification from the malevolent influences that have been directed against your family.
But understand clearly, this is not a passive ceremony in which you simply receive divine protection. This is active supernatural warfare in which you become a combatant in conflicts that extend far beyond normal human experience. The preparations for Maklu reveal the comprehensive nature of the protective magic being employed. The central courtyard has been arranged as a ritual battlefield, with a bronze crucible positioned at the center, surrounded by concentric circles of different protective substances: salt, blessed by 7 different priests; flour mixed with herbs that grow only in temple gardens; powdered bones from animals sacrificed specifically for exorcism purposes. Around the perimeter of the space, dozens of small figurines have been positioned, clay and tallow representations of the supernatural attackers who will be ritually destroyed during the night's ceremonies. These figurines represent one of the most sophisticated aspects of Mesopotamian protective magic, the principle of sympathetic destruction. Each small figure has been crafted to embody specific characteristics of the malevolent forces targeting your family. Some bear the features of known supernatural entities: demons, hostile spirits, supernatural predators. Others represent the human practitioners whose witchcraft has created your family's current crisis. Crude clay figures modeled to resemble specific individuals who might have reason to wish your household harm. During the Maklu ceremony, these figurines will be systematically destroyed through burning, symbolic torture, and ritual defilement, with each act of destruction intended to produce corresponding effects on the supernatural forces they represent. But the physical preparations represent only the most visible aspect of the magical working being prepared. Nergal-ushezib and his assistants have spent days in preliminary rituals designed to establish spiritual contact with the divine forces whose assistance will be essential for the night's success. The gods of heaven and netherworld must be properly approached, their aid formally requested, their specific areas of supernatural authority acknowledged and respected. Most critically, the entire cosmic order must be convinced to pause and support the patient's cause, a suspension of normal spiritual neutrality that allows divine forces to intervene directly in what is essentially a conflict between competing human magical practitioners. The witches who have targeted your family are not acting alone. Nergal-ushezib continues as the first stars appear in the darkening sky. They have allied themselves with supernatural forces that provide them with knowledge and power far beyond normal human capabilities. To defeat such enhanced malevolence, we must invoke equally powerful protective forces and demonstrate our willingness to engage in spiritual combat according to rules that govern supernatural warfare rather than normal human conflict. This warning highlights one of the most dangerous aspects of participating in Maklu ceremonies: the transformation of ordinary citizens into active combatants in supernatural conflicts. Unlike passive protective measures, amulets, blessed objects, household rituals, the burning ceremony requires participants to deliberately engage with malevolent forces for the purpose of destroying them through magical means. Such engagement inevitably exposes participants to direct supernatural attack during the ritual process, and the possibility of failure carries consequences that extend far beyond simple failure to achieve protection. As full darkness settles over Babylon and the first phase of the ritual begins, you feel the weight of cosmic attention focusing on the small courtyard where you stand. The invocation of the stars proceeds according to ancient formulas that predate the founding of the city itself, calling upon astral powers whose names were already archaic when the first Mesopotamian priests learned to read the movements of the heavens. These are not the familiar gods of daily worship, but rather the primordial forces that govern the fundamental structures of reality itself, entities whose intervention in human affairs represents a suspension of the normal cosmic order. Hear us, eternal watchers, you who never sleep, you who see all that transpires in the darkness, Nergal-ushezib chants as he raises his arms toward the star-filled sky. We call upon your ancient authority, your power to illuminate truth and expose deception. Let your light penetrate the shadows where our enemies hide. Let your wisdom guide our hands in the destruction of those who work malevolence against the innocent. The response to this invocation comes immediately and unmistakably. The air grows thick with supernatural presence, heavy with the attention of beings whose existence spans cosmic rather than human time scales. The oil lamps positioned around the ritual space begin to flicker in patterns that suggest communication rather than random movement. Most unsettling of all, the temperature drops noticeably despite the warmth of the evening, as if the very fabric of normal reality has been altered to accommodate the presence of forces that normally exist far beyond the boundaries of human experience. You realize, as the first hour of the Maklu ceremony unfolds around you, that you have committed yourself to a night that will either provide complete resolution of your family's supernatural crisis or transform that crisis into something far more dangerous and comprehensive. There is no middle ground in the magical combat you are about to engage. Either your supernatural attackers will be identified and destroyed, or their retaliation for your resistance will escalate beyond anything you have previously experienced. The ritual that was meant to protect your family may instead serve as the catalyst for supernatural warfare whose consequences could extend across generations. As Nergal Ushezib begins, the first of nearly 100 incantations that will structure the night's magical work, you cannot escape the knowledge that you have crossed a threshold from which retreat is no longer possible. The Maklu Vigil represents the ultimate expression of human resistance to supernatural malevolence, but it also represents the ultimate risk, the possibility that in seeking to destroy your magical enemies, you may instead provide them with the opportunity to destroy you more completely than would have been possible through their original attacks. The true magical combat begins during the second hour after sunset, when Nergal Ushezib approaches the bronze crucible that serves as the focal point for the night's destructive work. The vessel itself is a masterpiece of magical craftsmanship, its surface inscribed with protective formulas in multiple ancient languages and sanctified through ceremonies that connected it to the deepest sources of divine power. As the exorcist kindles the first flames within the crucible, the fire that emerges burns with colors that exist nowhere in normal human experience, blues that seem to contain their own light, reds that pulse with supernatural intensity, yellows that appear to move independently of the flames that produce them. Now begins the destruction of those who have worked evil against your house, Nergal Ushezib announces as he lifts the first of the tallow figurines from its position around the ritual circle. The small figure represents a warlock, a male practitioner of malevolent magic whose supernatural activities have contributed to your family's suffering. The figurine has been crafted with meticulous attention to detail, features that suggest cruelty and malevolence, hands positioned as if weaving invisible curses, feet planted firmly as if standing in confident assertion of magical dominance. The process of destruction proceeds according to formulas that have been refined through
centuries of magical practice.
Nergal Ushezib holds the figurine above the supernatural flames while reciting specific incantations designed to establish a connection between the clay representation and the actual supernatural forces it embodies. As this image burns, so burns the power of the one it represents. As these flames consume this false body, so may divine fire consume the malevolent will that has been directed against the innocent. When the figurine is finally cast into the crucible, the response exceeds anything you expected from a simple
magical ritual. The supernatural flames roar upward with sudden intensity, reaching heights that should be impossible for such a small fire.
The air fills with sounds that might be screaming or might be wind, depending on how you choose to interpret sensory input that exists at the edge of normal human perception. Most unsettling of all, the destruction of the figurine produces a smell that suggests the burning of actual flesh rather than the tallow and clay materials from which it was constructed. The connection is established, Nergal Ushizib observes with satisfaction, as the supernatural flames gradually return to
normal intensity. Your enemy feels the first touch of the divine fire that will ultimately consume him.
But this is only the beginning. We have dozens more figurines to burn, and each destruction will intensify the pressure on those who have worked malevolence against your family. The systematic burning of supernatural representations continues throughout the night according to a carefully planned sequence designed to maximize the cumulative effect of repeated magical assault. Figurines representing various categories of supernatural attackers are destroyed in specific order. First, the human practitioners who initiated the original magical assault, then the demonic allies they summoned to enhance their malevolent capabilities, finally, the spiritual parasites and opportunistic supernatural predators who attached themselves to your family once the initial attacks created vulnerability to additional harassment. Each burning produces its own distinct supernatural phenomena. The destruction of figurines representing female witches generates flames that burn with a cold intensity that seems to absorb heat rather than produce it, while simultaneously filling the air with sounds that might be laughter or sobbing. The burning of figures representing demonic allies creates explosions of light and sound that illuminate the entire courtyard and echo off the surrounding buildings with supernatural volume. Most dramatically, the destruction of parasitic spirit representations produces visual effects that allow you to actually see shadowy forms writhing within the flames, perhaps the supernatural entities themselves being consumed by the magical fire, or perhaps simply manifestations of the spiritual energies being unleashed by the ritual process. Each burning weakens our enemies and strengthens our position, Nergal Ushezib explains during a brief pause in the destructive sequence. But their retaliation is also intensifying. Can you feel the pressure building around us? They know what we are doing, and they are marshalling their own supernatural resources to strike back. The most dangerous part of the night lies ahead, the hours when our magical assault reaches its peak and our enemies respond with everything they can summon against us. The mounting supernatural tension becomes increasingly apparent as the night progresses. The air around the ritual space grows thick and oppressive, charged with malevolent energies that make breathing difficult and thinking clearly nearly impossible. Shadows begin moving independently of any objects that could cast them, suggesting the presence of hostile supernatural entities gathering just beyond the protective barriers that surround the ceremony. Most alarmingly, you begin to hear voices calling your name from multiple directions, not the desperate whispers of hungry ghosts, but the commanding tones of beings who expect obedience and are accustomed to receiving it. They are trying to break your concentration, Nergal Ushezib warns as the hostile voices grow louder and more insistent. Supernatural attackers know that magical rituals require sustained focus and emotional stability. They will do everything possible to frighten, confuse, or anger you into making mistakes that could disrupt the protective formulas that are keeping us safe. The psychological pressure of maintaining focus during supernatural assault proves more challenging than any physical hardship you have ever endured. The voices calling your name shift between threats and promises, alternately warning of terrible consequences if you continue the ritual and offering remarkable rewards if you abandon the magical combat and accept alliance with the forces currently attacking you. More subtly, the supernatural harassment includes attempts to alter your perception of reality itself. Moments when the familiar courtyard seems to transform into alien landscapes, when Nergal Ushezib appears to take on monstrous characteristics. when the protective ritual feels like participation in malevolent rather than defensive magic. Trust only what you knew to be true before the ritual began, the exorcist advises as he prepares for the next phase of the ceremony. Our enemies are masters of illusion and deception. They will show you false visions, plant false memories, convince you that friends are enemies and enemies are friends. The only reliable guides through such supernatural assault are the ritual
formulas themselves and your original commitment to protecting your family.
As the night reaches its midpoint, the Maklu ceremony shifts from purely destructive magic to more complex spiritual operations designed to ensure that the supernatural attackers cannot simply regenerate their malevolent capabilities after the immediate magical assault concludes. This phase involves the ritual defilement of figurines representing the personal fate goddesses of the witches who have targeted your family, supernatural entities that embody their magical practitioners, luck, protection, and spiritual resources. The defilement process proves particularly disturbing to witness. Instead of destruction through fire, these figurines are subjected to systematic humiliation designed to break the spiritual connections that allow supernatural practitioners to maintain their magical power. Black liquids are poured over the representations while specific curses are recited, binding the fate goddesses to failure and misfortune. The figurines are then positioned in degrading postures and surrounded by objects that symbolize defeat, abandonment, and spiritual poverty. When a practitioner's fate goddess is successfully defiled, their magical capabilities begin to collapse from within, Nergal Ushezib explains as he completes the complex procedure. They may retain knowledge of supernatural techniques, but they lose the spiritual support that makes those techniques effective. Most importantly, they lose the protection that normally shields magical practitioners from the consequences of their own malevolent activities. This aspect of the Maklu ceremony reveals its ultimate purpose, not merely to provide temporary protection for your family, but to permanently cripple the supernatural capabilities of those who have targeted you. The ritual represents total, magical warfare designed to eliminate rather than simply deter supernatural threats. Such comprehensive destruction of enemy capabilities ensures that your attackers cannot resume their assault once the immediate protective effects of the ceremony fade, but it also guarantees that their retaliation during the ritual itself will be correspondingly desperate and dangerous. As the night enters its final phase and dawn begins to approach, the supernatural pressure around the ritual space reaches
levels that test the limits of human endurance. The air itself seems to have become malevolent, pressing against your skin with almost physical force.
The voices calling your name have multiplied into a chorus of supernatural entities demanding that you abandon the protective ritual and submit to their authority. Most challenging of all, the prolonged exposure to magical energies has begun to produce physical symptoms, severe headaches, nausea, temporary blindness, and brief periods of paralysis that suggest your human nervous system is approaching the limits of its capacity to process supernatural stimuli. But even as your body struggles to cope with the magical assault, you can sense that the tide of supernatural warfare is beginning to turn in your favor. The voices of your enemies sound increasingly desperate rather than commanding. The supernatural phenomena attacking the ritual space are becoming more chaotic and less focused, suggesting that the systematic destruction of figurines has successfully disrupted the organizational capabilities of the forces targeting your family. Most encouragingly, Nergal Ushezib's demeanor has shifted from grim determination to cautious optimism as he prepares for the final phase of the ceremony, the dawn rituals that will seal your victory and ensure that your supernatural enemies cannot recover from the devastating magical assault they have endured. As the first pale light of dawn begins to penetrate the supernatural darkness that has surrounded the ritual space throughout the night, Nergal Ushezib begins the most delicate phase of the Maklu ceremony, the transition from destructive
magic to protective purification. The bronze crucible that served as an instrument of supernatural warfare must now be transformed into a vessel of spiritual cleansing, while you yourself must shift from the role of magical combatant to that
a purified victim ready to return to normal human existence. The sun god rises as your savior, the exorcist chants, as he performs the complex procedures required to neutralize the destructive energies that have been unleashed during the night. Divine light penetrates the shadows where your enemies attempted to hide. The malevolent forces that stalked your family are exposed, weakened, scattered by the approaching day. But even as these hopeful words fill the air, you can sense that the supernatural warfare of the previous hours has left permanent changes in the spiritual landscape around your household. The most immediate evidence of victory emerges as Nergal Ushezib prepares the final ritual element, a bronze bowl filled with pure water that will serve as a mirror for your spiritual renewal. As he positions the vessel to catch the first rays of the rising sun, the water begins to glow with a light that seems to come from within rather than from any external source. This supernatural illumination signals the successful completion of the night's magical work. Your enemies have been defeated, their malevolent capabilities destroyed, their supernatural allies banished or eliminated. Look into the water and see yourself as you truly are, Nergal Ushezib instructs as he guides you to kneel beside the glowing bowl. The reflection you observe represents your spiritual status after the night's purification. Any traces of malevolent magic that may have attached themselves to your family during the months of supernatural assault will be revealed and can be finally cleansed away. The face that looks back at you from the supernatural mirror shows unmistakable signs of the spiritual transformation you have undergone. Your features appear sharper, more defined, as if the magical combat has burned away elements of softness or uncertainty that previously characterized your appearance. Your eyes hold a new intensity, the particular alertness that comes from having survived direct confrontation with forces that exist beyond normal human experience. Most significantly, there is a quality of inner light that seems to emanate from within, suggesting that the defensive magic employed during the Maklu ceremony has left you permanently enhanced in ways that will provide ongoing protection against future supernatural threats. But the reflection also reveals costs that become apparent only in the aftermath of successful magical warfare. The spiritual intensity that now characterizes your appearance carries with it a corresponding isolation from normal human community. You have seen and done things during the night that cannot be shared with people who have never participated in supernatural combat. The knowledge and capabilities you have gained through magical initiation will forever separate you from neighbors who live within the comfortable boundaries of purely conventional existence. The victory is complete, Nergal Ushezib confirms as he completes the final purification rituals. Your supernatural enemies have been identified, defeated, and permanently disabled. The malevolent magic that has plagued your family for months
has been not merely neutralized but reversed. Your attackers will now experience the consequences of their own malevolent intentions.
Most importantly, you have been marked by divine forces as someone under supernatural protection, making future magical assault extremely difficult for any practitioner to attempt successfully. This comprehensive resolution of your family's supernatural crisis should provide unqualified relief, but instead you find yourself struggling with complex emotions about what has been accomplished. The Maklu ceremony has indeed solved the immediate problems that prompted you to seek magical assistance. Your wife's nightmares have stopped. Your daughter's mysterious illness has begun to improve. Your own episodes of memory loss have ceased entirely. But the price of this supernatural victory includes changes in your fundamental relationship with reality itself that may prove more challenging than the original magical assault. The most obvious transformation concerns your enhanced sensitivity to supernatural phenomena throughout your neighborhood, where once you could move through daily life in comfortable ignorance of the spiritual tensions and magical activities that surround ordinary families, you now perceive such things with uncomfortable clarity. You can detect the presence of protective amulets in other homes, sense the spiritual debts created by neglected ancestral obligations, and even identify households where supernatural threats are gathering for future attacks. This enhanced awareness provides valuable information for your own spiritual defense, but it also creates a burden of knowledge about dangers and influences that most people prefer not to acknowledge. More challenging is the recognition that participation in magical warfare has fundamentally altered your family's position within the community. Your neighbors' responses to your successful supernatural defense range from envious requests for magical assistance to fearful avoidance based on concerns about associating with people who have proven capable of supernatural violence. A few families express open hostility, arguing that magical combat represents dangerous escalation of spiritual conflicts that might ultimately draw divine punishment upon the entire district. These social complications reflect broader tensions within Mesopotamian society about appropriate responses to supernatural threats. While most families accept the necessity of basic protective measures, amulets, household rituals, occasional consultation with priests, the extensive magical warfare represented by maklu ceremonies raises questions about the proper limits of human involvement in supernatural conflicts. Are you and your family pioneers of more effective spiritual defense strategies? Or are you dangerous extremists whose magical activities threaten the spiritual stability of the broader community? Perhaps most troubling is the growing awareness that your victory over supernatural attackers has been achieved through methods that are themselves supernatural in nature. The magical techniques employed during the maklu ceremony involved invoking divine forces, manipulating spiritual energies, and performing acts of supernatural destruction that differ from the original magical assault, primarily in terms of defensive rather than offensive intent. You have defeated witchcraft through superior witchcraft, overcome supernatural malevolence through more powerful supernatural intervention. This realization forces uncomfortable questions about the moral status of
magical defense.
Are the protective capabilities you have gained through participation in maklu ceremonies fundamentally different from the malevolent abilities possessed by the supernatural attackers you defeated? Has solving your family's magical crisis required accepting transformation into something approaching the very type of supernatural practitioners who originally threatened your household? Nergal Ushezib provides perspective on these concerns as he completes the cleanup of the ritual space and prepares to depart. Every family must choose between vulnerability and capability, he observes, as he carefully stores the magical implements that made the night's work possible. The supernatural forces that threaten human welfare are not going away. They are ancient, persistent, and constantly seeking new opportunities to cause harm. You can accept helplessness when such forces target your household, or you can acquire the knowledge and capabilities needed to resist them effectively. The magic you have employed tonight is defensive in purpose and divine in authorization, he continues. The gods themselves have sanctioned your actions and provided the power that made your victory possible. You have not become practitioners of malevolent magic, but rather agents of cosmic justice, using supernatural means to restore proper spiritual balance that was disrupted by the malevolent activities of others. This interpretation provides some comfort, but it cannot entirely resolve the fundamental transformation that successful magical defense has produced in your family's spiritual status. You have crossed a threshold from helpless victims of supernatural attack to active participants in magical conflicts that extend far beyond normal human experience. The capabilities you have gained and the divine connections you have established during the Maklu ceremony represent permanent changes that will influence every aspect of your future existence as you return to your home in the growing light of dawn, carrying the supernatural protections and enhanced capabilities that represent the fruits of a night's magical warfare. You cannot escape the knowledge that your family's relationship with reality itself has been fundamentally altered. You have achieved comprehensive victory over the supernatural forces that threatened your household, but that victory has required accepting transformation into something that transcends the purely human existence you previously took for granted. The terrible irony of magical defense in ancient Mesopotamia is that the most effective protection against supernatural threats requires embracing supernatural capabilities that permanently distinguish the protected from those who remain purely human. In seeking to preserve your family's safety and normal existence, you have guaranteed that normal existence is no longer possible, replaced by enhanced but isolated participation in spiritual conflicts that will continue as long as human communities remain vulnerable to the malevolent forces that prowl the spaces between worlds, seeking opportunities to transform the innocent into either victims or unwilling allies in cosmic struggles whose ultimate purposes remain as mysterious as the darkness from which they emerge.